On nights like this, when snow falls so thick it silences the world, you can feel the weight of winter pressing on every rooftop and every heart. In a small Colorado town, where time often feels like it stands still, something happened that would change everything. This wasn't just a story about a dog or an officer doing his duty. It was about mercy, pain, and the chance for hope where hope seemed impossible. And it began with a cry in the night. Snow-blanketed Evergreen, Colorado, a place of quiet streets and weary buildings that had stood through decades of storms. The old courthouse clock no longer ticked, but the people of Evergreen lived on, most of them tucked into warm homes, fires burning low in their hearths. The town was ordinary, even forgettable, but tonight it would become the setting for something unforgettable. Patrolling those streets in his dark blue cruiser was Officer Mark Johnson, a man in his early 40s who had lived through enough sorrow to know the value of compassion. Tall and broad-shouldered, his storm-gray eyes carried both strength and sadness, a reflection of years spent protecting others while quietly grieving his own younger brother, lost in a car accident long ago. Lines on his face spoke not of cruelty, but of exhaustion, and perhaps of the burden of caring too deeply. Mark had earned the respect of the town not because of his badge, but because of his heart. He was the kind of man who offered his hand before his authority, who listened before he acted. As his cruiser rolled slowly down the snow-choked streets, headlights cutting through the curtain of white, the radio crackled to life. A trembling voice broke through the static. "Officer Johnson. It's me, Mrs. Walker. There's something out back. The dog's been crying all evening. I can't bear it anymore. Please, you have to come." Mark knew the voice well. Mrs. Walker was 78, living alone in the small house at the edge of town. Once a schoolteacher, sharp and stubborn, she carried both kindness and loneliness in equal measure. Her husband had been gone for decades, and the silence of her home made her sensitive to the cries of anything that still clung to life. "Stay inside, Mrs. Walker. I'll check it out," Mark replied gently, his tone calm but urgent. He turned. Down her street, tires crunching on the frozen ground. When his headlights swept across the yard, they froze on something that made his heart jolt in horror. Beneath the dark silhouette of an ancient oak, a frail German shepherd dangled from a rope. The animal's body sagged against the noose, ribs sharp beneath a mangled coat, paws scraping helplessly at the tree trunk. Snow clung to his whiskers and eyelashes as his brown eyes, once proud and bright, now shone only with terror and surrender. Mark was out of the cruiser in seconds, boots tearing through the snow. "Easy, boy. Hold on. I've got you," he muttered. His knife flashed as he cut the rope, and the dog fell into his arms with a faint, broken whine. The shepherd trembled violently. His body was cold and scarred, his breathing shallow and rough. Yet in the midst of pain, he tilted his head weakly and pressed it against Mark's chest, as if recognizing a kindness he hadn't felt in years. Mark's throat tightened. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. The door creaked open behind him. Mrs. Walker stood on her porch wrapped in a wool shawl, snow swirling like smoke around her. Her frail frame shivered as she called out, "I told you, he's been suffering for weeks. Belongs to that drunk across the lot. Man spends every night at Miller's bar, then comes home meaner than the devil." Mark's jaw clenched. He knew exactly who she meant, Tommy Harlan. Once a mill worker, now a bitter man in his late 30s who drowned every night in whiskey. Hollow-cheeked, hunched, and quick to anger, Tommy's reputation for fights, broken debts, and cruelty was no secret. This time, Mark muttered, tightening his grip on the shepherd, "He's gone too far." The dog whimpered again, his body heavier than Mark expected, as if the weight of suffering itself pressed down on him. Mark carried him gently toward the cruiser. "Mrs. Walker," he called, steady but firm. "I'll need you to give a statement later. For now, keep your door locked. If Tommy comes back, don't open it." Tears glistened in the old woman's eyes. "Bless you, officer. That dog deserves better than this world has given him." Mark laid the dog carefully across the back seat, pulling off his heavy coat to wrap the shivering frame. Snow blew in through the open door, dusting the animal's fur, but the car heater pushed back against the cold. In the rearview mirror, Mark caught the shepherd's half-closed eyes. There was more than pain there. There was a flicker, a question, a will to live. "You're safe now," Mark whispered, voice low but fierce. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." The dog stirred, faintly, his tail twitching once against the seat. Small, but enough to fill Mark with determination. He flipped on the siren. Its wail cut through the silent, snow-covered streets as the cruiser sped toward Evergreen Veterinary Clinic, the only 24-hour facility within 30 miles. But neither Mark nor the broken dog knew that just a block behind them, a boy was following. Ethan Miller, 12 years old, trudged through the storm with a phone clutched in mittened hands. His blonde hair stuck out beneath a knitted beanie, his cheeks red from the cold. Curious to a fault, Ethan had slipped from bed when the flashing lights woke him, and what he saw stirred something deep inside. From behind a hedge, he had watched it all. The rope, the desperate dog, the officer who cut him free. Snow swirled like a cruel painting around them, and Ethan's small hands shook as he pressed record. The image on his screen, the suffering animal, the quiet heroism, burned into him. Now, replaying the clip over and over, he ran after the cruiser, determination shining in his eyes. Meanwhile, inside the warm, fluorescent glow of the veterinary clinic, Officer Johnson pushed through the doors with the shepherd in his arms. Behind the counter, a young woman leapt to her feet. This was Anna Perez, a veterinary assistant in her mid-20s. Petite, with olive-toned skin and dark curls tied back in a ponytail, she had kind eyes, but carried a nervous energy. The daughter of immigrants who had worked endless hours to build a life in Evergreen, Anna had grown up balancing school with helping in her parents' small grocery. That upbringing left her diligent and cautious, but also deeply compassionate. As she saw the officer stumble in with the limp dog in his arms, her sneakers squeaked sharply against the linoleum floor as she rushed forward. "Officer Johnson, what happened?" she gasped, eyes widening at the sight of the limp shepherd in his arms. "Abuse," Mark said tersely. "I cut him down myself. He's barely hanging on." Anna held the door to the treatment room as Mark carried the dog inside. Stainless steel counters gleamed beneath the bright lights. A faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Anna hurried to fetch supplies, warm blankets, gauze, and IV fluids. Moments later, the clinic's veterinarian arrived. Dr. Samuel Green was a man in his late 50s, tall and lanky with a stooped posture from decades bent over examination tables. His salt and pepper beard framed a face that seemed perpetually tired, though his hazel eyes betrayed a well of gentleness. Known around Evergreen for volunteering at animal shelters, Dr. Green had a quiet authority. Tragedy had touched his life years earlier when his wife died suddenly, and though he rarely spoke of it, the loss had made him fiercely protective of creatures who could not speak for themselves. He strode into the room, pulling on latex gloves. "Set him down here," he instructed. His voice was calm, but clipped with urgency. Mark lowered the shepherd onto the table. The dog whimpered, flinching at the cold steel, then stilled, as Mark laid a reassuring hand on his side. The shepherd shifted, pressing his muzzle weakly against Mark's wrist, a gesture that pierced through the officer's hardened exterior. Dr. Green's hands moved quickly, checking vitals, examining the rope burns, the bruises along the ribs, the frostbitten. Pause. "He's dehydrated, underweight, but he's a fighter," Green muttered. "We'll stabilize him, start fluids, treat the wounds. It'll be a long recovery, but he's not gone yet." Mark exhaled, relief washing over him like thawing ice. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover the costs." Green glanced at him briefly. Costs don't matter tonight. Saving him does. Outside the glass door, Ethan pressed his nose to the window, trying to see. His phone's battery was nearly dead, but he'd already uploaded the video to his social media account. By the time Anna noticed him and waved him inside to get warm, the clip had begun to spread. Friends liking, sharing, commenting. "This is unreal." One message read, "Hero cop saves dog in the snow." Another, "Find this officer. He's a good man." Ethan slipped into the waiting room, stamping his boots and shivering. When Anna asked what he was doing out so late, he muttered, "Just needed to see." She frowned but handed him a cup of cocoa from the vending machine. Back in the treatment room, Mark kept his hand on the shepherd while Green inserted the IV. The dog gave a faint twitch of protest, but then relaxed, his breathing evening out under the steady drip of fluids. Mark leaned close and murmured, "You're safe now, Ranger?" The name slipped from his lips, unbidden, as if the dog himself had whispered it into the silence. "Ranger!" The shepherd's tail brushed once against the table, a fragile acknowledgement. Anna smiled faintly. "Ranger, I think he likes it." Mark nodded, eyes still fixed on the dog. "Ranger, it is." Snow still battered the clinic windows, the storm unrelenting. But within that small bright room, a fragile bond had been forged between man and animal, between survival and hope. And in the corner of the waiting room, a boy with a phone unknowingly held in his hands the seed of a story that would soon travel far beyond Evergreen's frozen streets. The snowstorm had passed by morning, leaving Evergreen wrapped in a brittle silence. Streets were blanketed in white, roofs glittered with frost, and the courthouse loomed in the town square, its old brick walls dusted with ice. For years, the courthouse had mostly dealt with small disputes, unpaid property taxes, neighborly quarrels, petty thefts. But on this day, its steps were crowded, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and protesters waving signs scrolled with "Justice for Animals" and "Stop the Abuse." Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Wooden benches creaked as people packed into the courtroom. Locals squeezed shoulder to shoulder, with journalists from Denver and beyond. At the center of it all sat Tommy Harland, the accused. He wore a wrinkled brown jacket and faded jeans, his wiry frame slouched defiantly. His face, unshaven, carried an air of resentment. Tommy's blue eyes were bloodshot from years of drinking, and his lips curled in a sneer whenever whispers rippled through the room. For him, sympathy had long been replaced by bitterness. At the prosecution table sat District Attorney Karen Mitchell, a woman in her late 30s, sharp-featured with dark hair tied into a bun. Her posture was straight, her eyes cold with determination. Karen had grown up in Evergreen before leaving for law school, only to return years later after her father, once a sheriff, died. She was known for her uncompromising nature and a history of taking on cases that others avoided. To her, this trial was not just about a dog. It was about showing that cruelty, even in the smallest town, would not be ignored. Mark Johnson entered quietly, dressed in his uniform, a solemn presence that drew respectful nods from many in the gallery. His storm-gray eyes held a heaviness, but beneath it was steel. When he looked to the back of the room, his gaze softened. There, in a specially crafted wheelchair for injured animals, sat the German Shepherd Ranger. His fur was still patchy from shaved areas of treatment, and bandages wrapped his legs, but his posture was proud. Beside him was Dr. Samuel Green, who refused to let the dog attend without medical supervision. Riar's eyes scanned the room slowly, ears twitching, and for a moment the murmurs quieted. It was as though everyone recognized his silent testimony. In another row sat Ethan Miller, the boy who had recorded the rescue. He wore an oversized winter coat, his blonde hair messy, his small hands clutching his phone like it was a shield. His mother, Laura Miller, a tired-looking woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and a nurse's scrubs beneath her coat, sat protectively beside him. Laura had raised Ethan alone since his father left when the boy was 5. She often worried about her son's impulsiveness, but she couldn't hide her pride that his courage had sparked something bigger than both of them. Judge Henry Caldwell presided over the case. A stout man in his 60s with thinning white hair, his face was lined from years of listening to excuses and lies. Known for his fairness, but also for his intolerance of cruelty, Caldwell's reputation made both sides tread carefully. He adjusted his glasses, tapping his gavel once to bring the room to order. Court is now in session. State of Colorado versus Thomas Harland. Charges of aggravated animal cruelty. His voice echoed, steady as stone. District Attorney Karen rose, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is simple. On the night of the storm, Officer Mark Johnson responded to a call and discovered a German Shepherd starved, beaten, and left to hang from a rope. We will prove that the defendant, Thomas Harland, committed this act deliberately, and thanks to the courage of a local boy, we have the video evidence that shows Officer Johnson cutting the dog free, saving its life. Gasps murmured through the gallery as Karen gestured to Ethan, who shrank in his seat but managed to raise his chin. Tommy's lawyer, a thin man named Richard Cole, stood to respond. He was in his 40s, balding with a quick tongue and a habit of smirking when he spoke. Known in town for defending drunk drivers and petty criminals, Richard's strategy was simple. So doubt, ladies and gentlemen, he said with a syrupy tone. My client may not be perfect, but there is no direct evidence that he tied the dog to the tree. Perhaps the dog wandered. Perhaps someone else is to blame. We must not let emotions cloud justice. The judge raised a brow but allowed the trial to continue. Mark was called first to the stand. He recounted the events with a calm, firm voice, though his hands tightened around the edges of the witness box when he described seeing Ranger dangling, gasping for life. I cut him down myself. If I had arrived minutes later, he'd be dead. His words hung in the silence, unshakable. Then Ethan was called. His small frame looked lost behind the stand, but when the video was played on the large monitor, the room fell, utterly still. The grainy footage showed Mark's silhouette in the snow, the rope being cut, the dog collapsing into his arms, and in the background, Mrs. Walker's quivering voice could be heard calling out. The authenticity of the moment needed no embellishment. Ethan's voice cracked as he said, I just wanted people to see the truth. Several in the audience wiped tears. Even Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his expression heavy. Outside the courtroom, the case had already drawn attention. Members of the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue League sat in the gallery, their pins glittering under the lights. Their director, Sandra Bell, a tall woman in her 40s with short auburn hair and a commanding presence, had spoken to reporters that morning. Sandra had dedicated her life to fighting animal abuse after finding a box of abandoned kittens as a teenager. To her, every case was personal. Now her eyes never left Ranger, her jaw tight with quiet fury. Dr. Green testified next, listing the injuries with clinical precision but clear disgust. This was not neglect. This was sustained cruelty. And the rope burns, the malnutrition, the bruising. This dog was deliberately harmed. His voice shook for the first time in years when he added, and yet he still presses his head against the man who saved him. That's resilience we humans should envy. By the time the defense attempted to argue, the weight of testimony and evidence had already shifted the tide. Richard Cole stumbled through weak points, trying to claim no one had seen Tommy tie the rope, but his words fell flat. The gallery had already judged with their eyes, their hearts. Finally, Judge Caldwell delivered his verdict. His gavel struck with finality. Thomas Harlan, this court finds you guilty of aggravated animal cruelty. You are hereby sentenced to 2 years in state prison and a lifetime ban on owning animals." The gallery erupted in murmurs, some in relief, some in anger, that the punishment wasn't harsher. But what lingered most was the sight of Ranger, sitting tall in his chair, his brown eyes steady as though he understood. The courtroom had fallen silent in those moments when he looked at Tommy not with hatred, but with the weary dignity of a survivor. As the bailiffs led Tommy away in cuffs, his curses echoing down the hall, Mark placed a hand on Rairce's back. The dog leaned into it, not trembling this time, but steady. In that quiet touch, everyone watching knew that the story was not about cruelty anymore. It was about justice finally being heard in the language of compassion. The courthouse had fallen, silent after the verdict, but for Officer Mark Johnson, the echoes of that day lingered long after. Tommy Harland was led away in chains. Yet the true weight of the trial rested not on the punishment, but on the fragile life that still fought to heal. Ranger, the old German shepherd, had become more than just a victim. He had become a symbol, and symbols, Mark knew, needed to be protected, nurtured, and given the chance to live again. Weeks passed in Evergreen, the snow softening as winter edged toward spring. The veterinary clinic became a second home for Mark. Each evening after his shift, he stopped by to check on Ranger. The dog's body was still gaunt, scars visible beneath his sable and silver coat, but the light in his eyes had changed. Where once there had been only fear and exhaustion, now flickered cautious trust. It was during one of these visits that Mark first met Dr. Emily Carter. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with auburn hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her green eyes carried both intelligence and warmth, though a trace of melancholy lingered there if one looked closely. Emily had moved to Evergreen only a year before, leaving behind a promising career at a large Denver animal hospital. Few knew the full story, but whispers suggested she had left after a devastating surgical loss, an accident that had shaken her confidence. Here, in the quiet of a small town, she sought to rebuild herself, one patient at a time. When Mark entered the treatment ward, he found Emily crouched beside Ranger, gently brushing his coat. Her long fingers moved with patience, careful not to touch the healing wounds. Ranger leaned into her touch, his ears flicking back slightly before settling in quiet acceptance. "You're Officer Johnson," she said without looking up. Her voice was calm, tinged with curiosity. "Mark," he corrected softly. "I'm no one special, just the guy who showed up that night." Emily finally glanced up, a faint smile touching her lips. "Ranger seems to think otherwise." Mark stepped closer, resting a hand on the shepherd's head. RER's tail gave a small thump against the floor, and Mark felt the warmth of that simple gesture. It was trust, still fragile, but undeniable. Over the following days, Emily took primary charge of RER's recovery. She adjusted his diet, small, frequent, meals to build his strength. She supervised hydrotherapy sessions, guiding him gently through a shallow water tank to help rebuild muscle without strain. She massaged his stiff joints, whispering encouragement. Through it all, Ranger responded with quiet resilience. The dog, that once flinched at every shadow, now began to lift his head when familiar footsteps approached. Mark often stayed late watching. Sometimes he cleaned stalls, sometimes he carried supplies, but mostly he was just present. For a man who had spent years patrolling empty roads and standing in silent kitchens after his brother's death, the quiet companionship felt like a healing of his own. One evening, as the last rays of winter sun filtered through the frosted windows, Emily called Mark into her office. The space was lined with veterinary textbooks and pinned photographs of animals she had saved. On her desk lay a thick folder stamped with the emblem of the Colorado Service Canine Rehabilitation Program. "I've been thinking about Ranger," she began, tapping the folder. "He's older, yes, and he's endured more than most dogs should. But his temperament, it's remarkable. Despite everything, he still seeks connection. That's rare. Mark crossed his arms, wary. What are you suggesting? Emily slid the folder across. There's a program for retired or rescued dogs. They're trained not for police combat, but for companionship and support, therapy, assistance, even specialized tasks. I believe Ranger could thrive there. Mark's brows furrowed. You think? He's strong enough? Emily's green eyes softened. Strength isn't only muscle, it's in his eyes. The way he leans into you instead of shrinking back. That's trust rebuilding. That's resilience. If given the chance, he could change lives beyond his own. Mark opened the folder, scanning pictures of dogs working in hospitals, schools, and nursing homes. Each image showed something he hadn't seen in years. Hope mirrored back through an animal's presence. Still, doubt lingered. He's been through hell. What if it's too much? Emily leaned back, her voice steady. Then at least we'll know he was given the chance to try, not just to survive. That night, Mark sat beside Ariar's kennel. The shepherd lifted his head, resting his muzzle against Mark's boot. The officer stroked his ears, murmuring, "What do you think, old boy? Ready to start again?" Rare's tail brushed the floor once, slow but certain. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Mark worked together, preparing Ranger for his evaluation. They introduced him to strangers who visited the clinic, testing his reactions. They walked him through the bustling farmers' market, gauging his comfort in crowds. Slowly, Ariar's posture shifted from wary to steady. His ears perked when children approached, his eyes softened when elderly hands stroked his fur. Meanwhile, word of Ranger's survival continued to spread. The video Ethan had posted weeks earlier had gained millions of views. Journalists still called, and the Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue League organized donation drives in Ariar's name. Local school children sent hand-drawn cards, pictures of a brown and black dog with words like, "Thank you for being brave," scrolled in crayon. For Evergreen, Ranger was no longer just a dog. He was proof that cruelty could be answered with compassion. Late one afternoon, as the last snow melted into the gutters, Emily stood with Mark in the clinic yard watching Ranger chase a ball across the patchy grass. His movements were awkward, slowed by age and injury, but there was joy in the way he pounced, in the way his ears flapped when he trotted back. "You see," Emily said, a rare brightness in her tone. "That's not a victim. That's a survivor ready for purpose." Mark bent down, taking the ball from Ariar's mouth. The dog nudged it back into his palm, brown eyes shining with expectation. For the first time in a long while, Mark laughed. In that moment, beneath the thawing sky of Evergreen, something fragile but enduring took root. A dog's belief that life could be good again, and a man's belief that second chances were worth fighting for. The first morning, Ranger arrived at the Colorado Service Canine Rehabilitation Center. The air was crisp with early spring. The facility sat on the edge of a forest clearing, its wooden buildings surrounded by wide training fields, agility courses, and quiet cabins where handlers lived during rotations. It wasn't a military base or police compound. It felt more like a retreat designed for healing as much as training. Mark stood beside Ranger, holding the leash loosely. The old shepherd's fur had grown thicker since winter, and those scars still marked his legs and shoulders. His stride was steadier now. His eyes, once dimmed by fear, carried a spark of curiosity. For the first time in months, he sniffed the ground eagerly, tail swaying gently. They were greeted by Captain William Hayes, the program director. Hayes was in his 50s, broad-chested with short-cropped gray hair and a firm jaw. A veteran of the Marine Corps, his left arm bore a faded tattoo of an eagle and dancore. Though his posture was rigid, his brown eyes revealed patience and respect, especially toward animals. Hayes had seen men and dogs broken by war, and he believed deeply in second chances for both. "Officer Johnson," Hayes said, extending a hand. His grip was strong, his voice low. "And this must be Ranger. I've heard his story. Let's see if he's ready for a new chapter." Mark nodded. "He's been through more than most, but he's still standing." Hayes crouched, extending his hand slowly toward Ranger. The shepherd sniffed, then nudged his nose into the man's palm. Hayes smiled faintly. "Good. That's trust. We can work with trust." The first week was an adjustment. Ranger was introduced to simple exercises, walking calmly beside volunteers, sitting still during medical checkups, responding to hand signals. At first, he hesitated, ears flicking nervously at sudden noises. But with patient repetition, he began to adapt. Emily visited on weekends, offering encouragement, and Mark stopped by after shifts whenever he could. The trainers praised Ranger's calm temperament, noting how quickly he bonded with humans once he felt safe. It was on the third day that Ranger met Bolt, a young Belgian Malinois, barely 2 years old. Bolt was the opposite of Ranger in every way: sleek, muscular, with a golden-brown coat that gleamed under the sun. His ears stood high, his eyes sharp and alert, and his energy seemed endless. Bolt had been bred for police work, but had washed out of a K-9 program because of his impulsiveness. He was brave, but too quick, too eager, needing guidance to balance his fire. At first, Ranger and Bolt eyed each other cautiously across the training yard. Bolt barked once, tail wagging, dropping into a playful crouch. Ranger tilted his head, then with surprising agility for his age, gave a short bark back. The trainers exchanged glances and chuckled. From then on, the two became unlikely companions. Bolt dashed across obstacle courses, Ranger trotting steadily behind. When Bolt grew frustrated at failing a balancing beam, Ranger would sit patiently beside him, as though teaching the younger dog the value of calm persistence. Bolt, in turn, pulled Ranger into games of chase, rekindling energy the older shepherd hadn't shown in years. Among the trainers was Sarah Lynn, a woman in her late 20s with black hair cut short and bright hazel eyes. Petite but strong, she carried herself with confidence. Sarah had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she found stability in training service animals. She believed dogs healed people as much as people healed dogs. Sarah was assigned as Rers's primary trainer. "He's steady," she told Hayes after a week. "Not fast, not flashy, but he has a grounding presence, perfect for therapy work." Training grew more specialized. Ranger was taught to identify the scent of medications, useful for reminding elderly patients to take their pills. He learned to press a button that triggered an alarm, alerting staff if a patient collapsed. He practiced lying beside volunteers, who feigned panic attacks, steadying them with his calm weight and steady breathing. At first it was awkward, his body stiff, uncertain. But with each session, Ranger grew more confident. His ears perked when he succeeded. His tail wagged when trainers praised him. One afternoon, Sarah set up a simulation. An elderly volunteer named George Whitman, a retired teacher in his 70s, with thinning white hair and a kind, wrinkled face. George pretended to struggle with his breathing, clutching his chest as he sat in a chair. Ranger approached slowly, sniffed, then placed his head gently on George's knee. The man's trembling hand settled on the shepherd's fur, and Ranger stayed still, eyes steady, a silent anchor. The room fell quiet. Even Hayes's stern expression softened. "That," he said, "is what this program is for." Meanwhile, Bolt excelled in agility drills, bounding through hoops and racing up ramps. But his reckless speed often caused him to stumble. Watching him, Ranger seemed to offer balance, his calm presence encouraging Bolt to slow down, focus, and try again. The trainers began pairing them for certain exercises, one dog's steadiness complementing the other's vigor. Outside of training, Ranger and Bolt shared a kennel yard. In the evenings, after long drills, they would lie side by side in the grass. Bolt chewed impatiently on a rope toy while Ranger simply watched the sun set, his gaze distant but peaceful. The young Malinois often nudged the toy-towered Ranger, who sometimes indulged with a soft tug before letting Bolt win. Their friendship, unlikely as it was, became a cornerstone of Rare's revival. Mark visited one night after his shift, finding Ranger and Bolt sprawled together in the yard. He leaned against the fence, watching quietly. Sarah joined him, wiping her hands on her jeans. "They make a good pair," she said. "One's fire, the other's stone." Mark chuckled softly. "Sounds like most partnerships I've seen on the force." Sarah glanced at him. "He's going to make it. Rangers, not just surviving anymore. He's teaching us what resilience looks like." As the weeks turned into months, Ranger's progress was undeniable. His coat shone again, his muscles strengthened, and his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, no longer carried the weight of despair. Where once he had been the image of suffering, now he was the image of renewal. For Mark, watching Ranger transform was a reminder that healing was possible, even for the most broken souls. And for Ranger, every new command learned, every nudge of encouragement offered was proof that trust, once shattered, could be built again, brick by brick, bark by bark. By the time spring fully bloomed across the Colorado hills, Ranger was no longer the victim of cruelty. He was a student, a teacher, and a partner. And with Bolt at his side, he was ready for whatever lesson came next. The spring morning was clear when Mark drove Ranger to Maple Haven Nursing Home. The two-lane road wound through fields where wild flowers had begun to push through the last traces of frost. Ranger sat in the back seat, his head lifted toward the open window, ears twitching at the sense of fresh grass and soil. His coat, though still marred with faint scars, gleamed under the sun. His brown eyes carried not fear but quiet anticipation, as if he somehow sensed this day would be different from the ones before. Maple Haven stood on a gentle hill overlooking Evergreen. The nursing home was a wide brick building with ivy creeping up its walls and a garden of roses and lavender surrounding its entrance. Though its exterior seemed serene, the halls inside were filled with stories of loneliness, regret, and fading memory. It was here that Ranger would take on a new role. Not a survivor, not just a trainee, but a silent healer. Waiting at the entrance was Margaret Collins, the director of Maple Haven. Margaret was a woman in her late 50s, tall and thin, with neatly styled silver hair and sharp blue eyes. She had once been a nurse, known for her discipline and no-nonsense approach. But life had softened her. Years of watching residents decline had taught her patience, and though she often appeared stern, those who knew her saw the warmth beneath. She bent down as Ranger approached, her hand steady as she stroked his head. "So this is Ranger," she said, her voice carrying authority, but also admiration. "You've been through storms, haven't you, old boy? Well, let's see if you can weather a few more." Mark gave her a nod. "He's ready. More ready than I thought he'd ever be." Inside the halls were lined with faded photographs and handmade quilts. Residents sat in wheelchairs or recliners, some staring absently at the television, others gazing out the windows as though searching for something lost long ago. When Ranger padded in, paws clicking softly against the floor, heads began to turn. Murmurs rippled through the hall. A few smiles appeared. Small, hesitant at first, then brighter. One of the first residents to meet Ranger was Mrs. Evelyn Hart, appetite woman in her 80s with snowy white hair and delicate features. Once a pianist, arthritis had curled her fingers and dimmed her music. Yet when Ranger placed his head gently on her lap, her face lit up. "Oh my," she whispered, stroking his fur with trembling hands. "I haven't felt this warm in years." The staff, too, noticed the change. Nurses who had grown accustomed to quiet routines now watched as residents became more animated. Conversations sparked. Laughter echoed faintly in corners where silence had lived too long. Rare's presence was not loud, not dramatic. It was steady, like a heartbeat reminding them they were still alive. Among the residents was Mr. James Howard, a 75-year-old veteran with broad shoulders and a rugged frame that had withered with age. His hair, once dark, was now mostly gray, and deep lines cut across his weathered face. Howard had served in Vietnam and carried invisible scars. He was known among staff for his restlessness, his haunted nights filled with shouting, and his refusal to sleep in his bed. Instead, he often sat upright in a chair, eyes scanning the dark, trapped in battles that ended decades ago. Mark had been warned about him. "Mr. Howard doesn't take kindly to dogs," one nurse said softly. "Too many memories." "We've treated before, but—" she trailed off. Still, Margaret insisted Ranger should try. And so, one quiet afternoon, Mark and Sarah Lynn, Rears's trainer, brought the shepherd to Howard's room. The old man sat by the window, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair, his eyes far away. When Ranger stepped inside, Howard stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I don't need no mud-sniffing around me," he growled, though his voice shook. Ranger paused, then slowly lowered himself to the floor, lying down a few feet away. He didn't bark, didn't move closer. He simply stayed, breathing steady, eyes calm. Minutes passed. Howard's glare faltered. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the dog's chest rising and falling. Finally, he whispered almost to himself, "Damned if you don't remind me of my old scout." That night, something remarkable happened. For the first time in years, Mr. Howard fell asleep in his chair without jolting awake in terror. The next morning, staff reported he had slept nearly through the night, his hand resting lightly on RER's back, who had curled up beside him. It was a breakthrough no medication had managed. From then on, Ranger became Howard's quiet companion. The old soldier no longer paced the halls at midnight. Instead, he sat with Ranger at his side, telling him stories no one else had heard. The rain in the jungle, the noise of helicopters, the faces of men who never came home. Ranger listened without judgment, his ears twitching, his eyes steady, as if he carried the weight of those memories so Howard didn't have to bear them alone. Word spread quickly through Maple Haven. Residents began asking when Ranger would visit. Their rooms. Mrs. Hart practiced playing short pieces on the piano again, encouraged by his steady gaze. A widower named Albert Dunn, who rarely spoke, began humming softly while stroking Rears's fur. Even staff found their days lighter. Ranger had become more than a therapy dog. He was a bridge, stitching together hearts frayed by loneliness. Mark watched with quiet pride. Sometimes, after long shifts, he would sit in the common room, Rears's head resting on his knee, and listen as the residents shared their stories. For a man who had carried his own grief in silence, those moments reminded him that healing was rarely loud. Sometimes it was as simple as breathing beside someone who needed you. As weeks turned to months, Maple Haven transformed. The halls no longer felt as heavy. Residents smiled more often. Families visiting noticed the difference, and staff carried less exhaustion in their steps. Ranger had not just entered a building, he had lit it from within. For Mr. Howard, the change was most profound. He began sleeping regularly, his nightmares less frequent. He laughed for the first time in years, a deep rumble that surprised even himself. When asked what had changed, he only pointed at Ranger and said, "That old dog fights battles for me when I can't." On a bright afternoon in early summer, Mark returned to Maple Haven to find Ranger lying in the garden, surrounded by residents, in wheelchairs and walkers. Birds chirped, sunlight dappled the grass, and laughter floated in the air. Ranger looked up, eyes warm, tail sweeping gently across the ground. In that moment, Mark realized the dog who had once hung broken from a rope now carried an entire community on his shoulders, not with force, but with gentleness. Ranger had become a silent healer, a companion whose presence restored dignity to those who thought they had lost it forever. Winter returned to Evergreen with a vengeance. Snow blanketed Maple Haven's roof in thick drifts, and the cold seeped into every corner of the old brick building. The radiators clanked through the night, struggling to keep the halls warm. Staff bustled to ensure residents were comfortable, never suspecting that danger lurked hidden in the wires running behind the walls. It was near midnight when the first spark flared in the utility room. An old circuit box overloaded by years of use hissed and spat. Within moments, flames licked upward, catching dry insulation and wooden beams. Smoke began to curl along the ceiling, dark and acrid. Ranger stirred before anyone else noticed. The old shepherd lifted his head from his spot beside Mr. Howard's bed. His ears pry-cricked, nose twitching at the faint smell of burning. The hallways were still, the air heavy with sleep. Ranger rose, body tense, then barked sharply once, twice, his deep voice breaking the silence. Mr. Howard jolted awake, confusion clouding his eyes. "What is it, boy?" he rasped, still half in his dreams. Then he smelled it too, the sharp, unmistakable tang of smoke. His body froze. Memories of burning. Villages. In Vietnam flooding back. Panic clawed at his chest, but Ranger pressed his nose firmly against the man's arm, grounding him in the present. Within seconds, Ranger was in motion. He bounded into the hallway, his paws skidding against the polished floor. The shepherd's bark echoed down the corridors, urgent and commanding. Doors opened, residents peeking out in confusion, until they too saw the smoke gathering. On duty that night was Nurse Linda Parker, a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and tired eyes behind round glasses. Known for her calm under pressure, she had worked double shifts more times than she could count to cover staff shortages. But when she saw Ranger charging toward her, barking frantically, her instincts sharpened. "Fire!" she shouted, grabbing the alarm. The klaxon wailed, red lights flashing across the halls. Chaos erupted. Elderly residents stumbled from their rooms, some clutching walkers, others frozen in fear. Smoke thickened rapidly, turning the air into a choking haze. Ranger ran back and forth, barking at those who lagged behind, nudging them toward the exits. When one frail man collapsed near the stairwell, Ranger barked until Linda and another aide rushed to lift him. In the middle of the confusion, a familiar voice called out, "Ranger!" It was Ethan Miller, bundled in a heavy parka, his blonde hair sticking out from under a wool hat. The boy had come with his mother to drop off blankets earlier that evening, but curiosity kept him lingering outside. When the fire broke out, he had his phone in hand. Through the smoke and flashing lights, Ethan recorded every moment. The shepherd darting from room to room, barking until residents shuffled awake, guiding them like a seasoned rescuer. His hands shook, but he knew instinctively this was history unfolding. In the West Wing, Ranger found Mrs. Evelyn Hart trapped in her wheelchair, the hallway already filling with smoke. The old pianist's eyes brimmed with tears, her hands trembling as she tried to push forward. Ranger darted to her side, tugging at the edge of her blanket, until Linda and another nurse arrived. Together, they pushed her chair swiftly toward the emergency exit. Evelyn reached down with a quivering hand, brushing RER's head. "You saved me," she whispered, though the words were nearly drowned by the roar of flames. As the fire spread, the roof above the east wing groaned ominously. Ranger barked again, this time more desperate. He ran into the thickest smoke, ignoring the shouts behind him. In one room, Mr. Albert Dunn, the quiet widower, sat frozen on his bed, paralyzed by fear. Ranger leapt onto the mattress, pressing his weight against the man's frail chest until Albert stirred. With a low whine, Ranger guided him to his feet and nudged him toward the door. Outside, snow swirled under the glow of emergency lights. Fire trucks had arrived, sirens wailing, firefighters rushing with hoses, residents huddled in blankets, coughing and shivering, but alive. And still, Ranger was not finished. He burst from the building once more, smoke staining his fur, eyes watering but determined. He circled the gathered crowd, barking sharply as if counting heads. Mark, who had sped to Maple Haven after hearing the call on his radio, caught his gaze. For a moment, man and dog locked eyes, and Mark understood. Ranger had led them all out. When the last resident was accounted for, the old shepherd staggered, his legs shook, lungs heaving, soot coating his muzzle. Ethan dropped his phone, rushing forward. "Ranger!" The boy's arms wrapped around the dog's neck, tears streaking his soot-covered cheeks. Mark knelt beside them, pulling Ranger into his arms. "Easy, boy. You did it. You saved them." The fire was contained by dawn, but the damage was heavy. Half the east wing reduced to charred ruins. Yet not a single life was lost. And as news spread, thanks in part to Ethan's video uploaded before sunrise, the story of a once-abused dog turned rescuer blazed across America. Clips of Ranger barking through smoke-filled halls, guiding frail residents to safety, played on every news channel. Headlines read, "From victim to hero, dog saves nursing home residents." At Maple Haven, the residents called him their guardian. For Mr. Powered, the miracle was even more profound. "I've fought enough battles," he said hoarsely, resting a hand on Rare's back. "But this one, he fought for me." That night, as snow fell softly over Evergreen, Ranger lay at Mark's feet, exhausted, but alive. His scars told the story of cruelty endured. His eyes, now shining, told the story of a community reborn through his courage. From victim to healer to hero, Ranger had become something larger than any one life. He had become a miracle. Spring broke gently over Evergreen, bringing longer days and skies painted in pale gold. The snow had melted from the rooftops of Maple Haven, replaced by blossoms that lined the garden paths. The nursing home, once marked by quiet sorrow, now pulsed with renewed energy. Much of this change, everyone knew, was owed to a dog who had walked through fire and carried hope on his back. Mark Johnson stood in his modest living room, papers spread across the oak coffee table. A single form lay on top, the official adoption certificate. Ranger rested on the rug nearby, his scarred frame stretched comfortably, head nestled against his paws. The shepherd's eyes followed Mark's every movement with quiet loyalty. Mark hesitated, pen poised. He thought back to that night under the oak tree, the desperate barking that first drew him. He remembered the cold steel of the knife cutting through. Rope, the faint brush of Rare's muzzle against his wrist. From victim to patient to healer and finally to hero. This was no longer just a dog he had saved. This was family. With a steady hand, Mark signed his name. "Welcome home, partner," he whispered. Rare's tail thumped once against the floor as though in solemn agreement. News of Rare's heroism had traveled far beyond Evergreen. Donations had poured in to rebuild Maple Haven, and reporters still called for interviews. But the community wanted more than articles. They wanted a symbol, something lasting. So it was decided a statue would be placed in Maple Haven's garden, honoring the shepherd who had saved them all. The dedication ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning. Families, townsfolk, and even officials from Denver gathered. A stage had been erected in the garden, decorated with spring flowers. At the center, covered with a white cloth, stood the statue. A bronze likeness of Ranger, head lifted proudly, eyes fixed forward as if guarding the horizon. At its base were engraved the words, "The Loyal Friend." Margaret Collins, the director of Maple Haven, gave the opening speech. She wore a navy blazer, her silver hair pulled back, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. "In our darkest night, This dog reminded us that courage comes in many forms. Today, we honor not only Ranger, but the resilience he represents in every heart. Applause rippled through the crowd. Children waved handmade signs. Elderly residents sat bundled in blankets, smiling through tears. Then came Mr. James Howard. Supported by a cane, the old veteran walked slowly to the podium. His broad shoulders were stooped with age, but his voice carried with the weight of truth. His hand trembled as he gestured for Ranger, who padded forward obediently, sitting tall. At his side, Howard placed his weathered hand on Rare's head. His eyes blue as a winter sky filled with tears. "This dog saved me," he said, voice breaking. "Not just in the fire, though God knows I'd be gone without him. He saved me from battles I thought I'd never escape. 4 years, I carried a war in my chest, and I thought it would never end. But this dog," he swallowed hard, "this dog saved my heart." The crowd fell silent, many dabbing at their eyes. Ranger leaned gently into Howard's touch, his calm presence louder than any speech. Ethan Miller stood nearby, clutching the camera he had used that night. Now 13, taller than before, his blonde hair untidy as ever, he recorded Ranger with a steady hand. When the applause swelled again, Ethan whispered to his mother, "I want to do something with my life that matters, just like him." Laura Miller, weary but proud, wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders. After the speeches, the cloth was pulled away. The bronze statue gleamed in the sunlight. Residents reached out to touch it. Children posed for pictures, and flowers were laid at its base. Rangers sat beside the monument, tails sweeping slowly, as though approving the likeness. Mark watched from a few steps back. For years he had carried the weight of grief losing his brother, enduring long nights of silence. Yet now, watching Ranger surrounded by love, he felt something loosen inside him. This wasn't just a story of saving a dog. It was the story of how a dog had saved them all. As the crowd dispersed, Mark crouched beside Ranger. "You've walked through darkness, old boy, and now look, you're the light they all needed." Ranger pressed his head against Mark's chest, eyes closing in trust. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the garden. Families lingered near the statue, laughter mixing with birdsong. Mr. Howard sat on a bench, finally at peace, while Ethan uploaded another video that would spread Rare's message further. And in the middle of it all, Ranger lay content, not as a victim, not even just as a hero, but as a companion who had found his forever place. For Evergreen, the statue would stand as a reminder of resilience. For Maple Haven, it was a promise of hope. For Mark, it was family. And for Ranger, it was the dawn of a life lived not in fear, but in love. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not thunder from the heavens, but quiet acts of courage, born in the darkest moments. Rare's journey reminds us that even what was once broken can be made whole again. From suffering to healing, from despair to hope, we see the hand of God working through loyalty, love, and second chances. In our everyday lives, we may not face burning buildings or courtrooms, but we all encounter moments where kindness can save someone's spirit. A gentle word, a listening ear, or simply being present can be the light that carries someone through their own storm. If you believe in miracles, if you believe that God can turn pain into purpose, type Amen in the comments. Let this story travel far, touching hearts and reminding the world that no act of compassion is ever wasted. Share this story. Leave your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that keep faith alive. May God bless you and your family, and may His protection be upon you.